Welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast, your weekly look inside the world of fly fishing presented by Pete Tigers. If you're enjoying listening, please consider subscribing.
David Profumo's life has been intertwined with fishing from an early age. It helped shape his career as a writer and has taken him to his new book, The Lightning Thread, that looks at the many aspects of our pastime. I speak with him about his fishing career and learn a little about his new book. David, it's great to have you along on the Fly Culture Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, Pete. Thank you. It's very nice to meet you, even remotely like this. I live most of my life up a glen in Perthshire here, so you'll see a rather pale light coming in through the window, but it's very welcome. And in fact, if I look out from my desk, I can see trout rising. And this has always been an ambition of mine. I've got a little lochen, or I suppose a pond, as you might call it, if you were down south, with some trout in it. And I'd always wanted to be able to look up when I'm scratching my brow, looking for the word for something, for an article or a piece of journalism, and be able to see from my desk fish. And until quite recently, we've had ice frozen everywhere. But I went out with a little bit of dog kibble a couple of days ago to see if there was any trout that had overwintered, and a couple rose. So I'm a happy chap. I guess that marks the beginning of my season to see fish rising from my workplace.
Fantastic. It sounds like you've got to tie up a dog kibble fly then to work on them too.
Well, there are such things, but let's not get into the dark arts quite early on. Actually, it's funny. Often I've talked to people who've got fishing of their own, and they say that they're very happy for other people to fish there, but it just doesn't have the same click, because I'm not saying my fish are tame, but, they're a kind of known quantity. And I get absolute fin fever whenever I see fish anywhere else, but not here on my lawn. So I've never actually in the last 5 years or so, fished for my own trout, but other people come and we have grandchildren, and sometimes float tackle somehow finds its way into my hands. To show them what we're meant to be doing. But it's a lovely spot. We've been here for about 5 years now. We're 1,600 feet up in Perthshire, with moorland behind and a bit of grazing in front and 2 trout locks. I mean, what more could you ask for, really?
Wow. Did it take you a long time to find what you and I would describe as the perfect, and the listeners as well, I guess, did it take you a long time to find that perfect location?
It did. I mean, it took almost the entire lifetime. My wife Helen and I, she's what I describe as a civilian. She's a non-angling person, and therefore deserves a medal to have put up with me for 45 years with my obsession, which I'm sure I'm preaching with the converted about this. But we spent a lot of time window shopping. I think it took about 7 years. We went to the west coast and north coast of Scotland, the borders, and had a lot of fun looking, and eventually found this place about 20 years ago, and it was hadn't been inhabited for quite a long while. It was looking a bit sorry for itself, but we came in May, and the flowers are at their height up the hill here in May, and in fact our daffodils are just starting now, and they're not quite out for Easter. We quite often have white Easters. So it's all really rather late, but May it was looking wonderful, and we decided this is the place. It was the view, I think, really, and we excavated a couple of, actually in Scotland they're called stanks, I think, but lochens, I would say, and it's beautiful clear water. It's like chalk stream water, because the water here, one always thinks of it being a rusty, peaty colour when you go to the Highlands. We're just in the Cairngorms National Park, but actually it runs off a seam of marble, which is most unusual for Scotland. And so it's a little bit like those northwestern clear lochs where they have mayfly and so on. And so I can actually look in and see the fish, which is a little bit like being down in Hampshire, which is where I go at this time of year anyway, to do a tour of duty around the chalk streams. So when our grandchildren have left in a week's time, I'm going to get on the train and come down and have 2 or 3 weeks down south. And I'm looking forward to that very much. The chalk stream, the chalk country is the other part of my great passion in terms of sort of surroundings and geography.
That sounds lovely and sounds incredibly inspiring as well. And it was interesting what you were saying about not really fishing the Lochans. And I remember, and I'm sure you'll know him, that in the old days I got a auction lot in the Wild Trout Trust with Ronnie Butler to fish
Oh,
his
yes.
section of the Ebble. And I remember talking to him and saying, "Oh, this is amazing. You've got this beautiful miniature chalk stream out the back of your door. You must be here all the time." And he said, if there's a canis hatch, I sometimes pop out. And it sounds a similar thing. And then my good friend Perry, who I fish with a lot of the time, has dug a lake. And I'm probably heading over there this afternoon, actually. And he's stocked it and sends me photos every day if I'm not there. And it's almost, we're not really fishing it. And I wait for him to say, should we catch a couple? And I kind of understand it now, actually. And I think I'd probably be the same if I had it. But it must be a dream for you to be able to do that. And do you find it has been inspiring that you've been sitting at the keyboard, perhaps when you were writing the book as well, and you found that and you looked out, seen a trout top, and that sort of taken your mind away, I guess, from thinking deeply about the next line and then refreshing and resetting again, does it?
Well, I think you put your finger up with the word refreshing. That somewhere I heard a phrase that one of the things that's so appealing about fishing is the emotional refreshment which it affords you. And I wish I knew who'd come up with that phrase. It seems just about right. And there's something, and fishing is good for you, and I think looking at fish is good for you. You can see why they have aquarial fish in dentist waiting rooms and so on. There is something kind of mesmeric about the idea of fish. And I pour the turf, rather, to mix the metaphors, when I'm not somewhere near fish and somewhere near fishing, and I feel someone out there is fishing and I should be joining them. But when I know I can stroll somewhere and just have a look at some fish, then that kind of does it for me for a while. But it's not the same thing as, obviously, part of the excitement is going to wild and unfamiliar places, and you get the click from that. But it's just I've always been fascinated by fish as creatures. I mean, I'm not a biologist; I have no scientific training of any sort, but I'm sure that it's something that's common to anglers. Is that, and it's this proverbial thing. You can always tell an angler because he has to stop and get out and look over a bridge. A bridge over water rather than a railway bridge, just in case there's something there, even if you're not going to fish for them. And I like that sort of hypnotic appeal of peering into water. It's a basic elemental thing, and many people have written about it and commented on it. But I think it's a real thing. And one of the excitements for me, and I'm sure as a widely travelled angler and writer yourself, it is that almost anywhere you go in the world, there is this shared enthusiasm for peering to see, is there something there? Is there something there? It's a great big sort of question mark, because water is has such a hypnotic fascination. I'd like to have had a little bit of river here, but when we were house hunting, anything which had got running water or migratory fish stocks became unaffordable, and I thought it wouldn't be fair on my wife for me to insist on having a beat of a salmon river. I suppose would have been even more ideal. But being in the centre, it's the sort of geographical centre of Scotland, in Perthshire, where we are, or cartographical centre, I believe they call it. We're within easy striking distance, no pun intended, of lots and lots of exciting fishing, and I'm a shameless sponger, as any friends of mine who might be listening will nod in agreement, and make myself as available as possible for day trips, which is lovely, because when we lived in London, when our children were small and we were bringing them up there where we were based, you kind of had to earmark a whole week, really, because there's 2 days travel, and now I'm kind of on the end of the phone if someone's kind enough to say the river's looking. I mean, the ideal thing is you get, you're having your breakfast and a mate calls and says, the river's looking good today, you like to come. It doesn't happen very often like that, but the fact that it could happen is also quite refreshing. So the nearest river, we're kind of up towards the top of the headwaters of the Tay, the mighty Tay system. And I have to say that the main river is quite daunting to me, especially in its lower reaches. I'm going there next week to Glendelvin, which is where Miss Ballantyne caught her historic record salmon, the centenary anniversary of which is this year in October, as I'm sure you know. And a magazine, not your magazine, but another, has commissioned me to go and be photographed fishing at the Bargee Stone, and we're going up to see the beast, as she called it, the original cast in the house, and so on. But the Tay, I find it a little bit daunting. The headwaters, which is kind of near where we live, are more intimate, more accessible. And there's a river called the Tilt, which is about half a mile from where I'm sitting, in the next strath north, and that's a tributary of a tributary of a tributary. And the fish probably don't, even with good water and the best will in the world, don't really come up from the main river until kind of July, August. And I did one day, the purpose of this rambling story is I did one day get a call from the proprietors who live in Blair Castle, and they have a house rod there. There's only 4 beats on this little river, precipitous, rocky, beautiful river. The artist Turner used to fish here. My friend said, we can't use our house rod, we'd like to go to beat 3. And I was, in fact, already sitting at my desk. I didn't have a lunch or anything. So I just shoved everything in the Land Rover and went, and it worked. You read about these things happening to other people, and you think, oh, damn, rats. God, I wish I had a life like that. But it only ever worked once. And I got 3 fish in an hour and a half, which I think hadn't been done by the Castle rods since 1980 something. Mind you, that it probably never happened again. And those sort of red letter opportunities, it's wonderful if you go to a Rolls-Royce beat somewhere, or the other Helmsdale or Neva or something, and you get several fish in a day. But to do it from a kind of a little headwater quite near your house, when everything comes together, and I expect you agree, Pete, but that we anglers are always looking for this coming together of good luck and the migratory fish being in the area and the right weather conditions, and you being the mindset being right, and you don't bungle the cast every time, which I normally do, and bam, it works. And those are the daydream days. And so I'm very, very fortunate. There's quite a lot of sort of day trip availability. My in-laws have got a croft in the Western Isles and the Isle of Harris, and we go there for quite a lot of our summer holidays, and they do a lot of lovely wild brownie and loch fishing there. So I'm really terribly lucky. In fact, my book could have been called, the memoirs of a fortunate angler. I know that, but you make your luck a bit, and then it will be wrong not to maximise it.
Absolutely. And with the salmon day that you mentioned there, I often think of the many hours of not catching a fish as an investment for that moment. And it doesn't, these days it seems to be a long wait, certainly where in my part of the world, for that moment, but it still seems worth it. And all of those hours, I don't mind, just for that line to come to life is I think, for me, certainly is what it's about. But it was interesting what you were talking about, the local fishing you have where you are now, and your affinity for chalkstream fishing as well, and your visit down there. Is there one, I get the sense, having read the book, that all fishing is good to you and you enjoy every aspect, be it saltwater, freshwater, whatever it may be, and casting a fly rod. But is there one species that really is the one for you, that you think, actually, if I had that one day to fish for that one fish again, what would you choose?
Well, I love the proverbial question, if you've got one day, perhaps I could have a week, if it was being the Grim Reaper. Because, it wouldn't be a salmon, I have to say, and I don't want to sort of sound disloyal because I've been very, very blessed with my salmon fishing. It would be either a wild brownie or a sea trout, actually, a Scottish sea trout, I think. I have to say I've had relatively little experience of night fishing for big Welsh sea trout and so on. And most of the fishing I've done for sea trout has been daylight fishing, and quite a bit of it has been loch fishing. So I think if you're going to allow me one more sortie, one more safari, I would probably go to a Hebridean sea trout loch after an August spate, early August spate, with a good westerly breeze and a man on the oars to look after me. I'd have a dapping rod on the bottom of the boat, telescopic dapping rod. I'd have choice of boat companion to needle and to chatter with, and a nice broken grey light on the surface. And I'd be very happy if that was my last day or part of my last week. I love sea trout, even in the very small sizes. It's a mysterious fish, as I'm sure you'll agree, because relatively little research has been done into British sea trout, because there's no kind of commercial investment in them in the way that has been for salmon. And in fact, as you know, in the bad old days, in a lot of rivers, they didn't even put the sea trout down in the record book. Of course, they would have done down in the West Country in England, but up on some of the spay beats, they were a kind of bycatch; didn't count, And I think that they've got the best of everything. I'm really at heart a trout fisherman rather than a salmon fisherman, because I feel, and I don't know, I'd be interested to hear your views, but that if you make a bit of a study of it, you can probably crack a bit of trout fishing on, from day to day, provided you don't bungle it. But the more salmon fishing I do, the more it becomes an absolute mystery to me. I'm quite suspicious of people who think that they've got, credible theories about why salmon sometimes throw away the rule book and come and grab your lure. And there's such a multiplicity of things that they will sometimes grab. But going back to what you were saying earlier, you have to pay your dues with salmon fishing. If you're lucky to go to a super duper place, or I've fished abroad a bit for salmon, and there's, quite big stocks, then obviously you make hay while the sun's shining if you can. But how many, they call it a fish of 1,000 casts, a fish of 1 million casts sometimes. I mean, weeks go by, in those, especially those dour summer weeks of no water and green weed and so on, manic depressive fish occasionally blushing out from behind the rock just to keep you going. And you don't know what to try, and very often they're not going to respond to anything legal. Whereas I think with trout, if you do sort of concentrate and try your best, you probably can winkle something out at the end of the day. The sea trout is a kind of the best of both worlds. I think, obviously it's migratory, it's very handsome, it's very delicious, a beautiful, beautiful fish in the hand. I mean, like you, I don't kill very many fish anymore. But again, in this special day, I would probably take a 3/4 pound finnock if I could get one, possibly even out of the salt water in the estuary, and I would have it for my breakfast. And I would die with a clear conscience, having breakfasted off a fresh finnock. And when I first went to the Western Isles, which is 40 odd years ago, there were so many little lochans that were connected to sea lochs and run-ins and estuaries. I mean, little spatey burns of maybe just 100 yards connecting them to the sea. And there were small sea trout in all of them. And unfortunately, now a lot of it has been poached out because they're very easy to net. And if people are not supervising, as we all know, you need migratory stocks need guardians. If you have a vested interest in the fish getting into your freshwater system. But also there's all other types of problems, estuarial problems, as we know, with fish farms. I don't want to spoil a lovely morning by perhaps going into the sins of aquaculture as I see them, but I think they're very real. And so they're getting a little bit hard to find, these lovely wild fish. But I don't know, something about, I mean, the magnificence of a salmon. I don't even mind if it's an old stale salmon. They're fantastic in their way as well, And I suppose as I'm getting older, I perhaps identify with the old red cockfish. It was a buster, good luck on you. But the little sea trout grabbing and leaping and jumping and you always think they're bigger than they are because they punch above their weight, if that's the phrase. And I think that's what I would go for. That's a long answer, but a considered one.
I think that's a very fine answer as well. And coming round to what you were saying about salmon and trout, I think you're exactly right, and I'm exactly in agreement with you about that, because it does feel like you say, you can identify the hatch, you can, with trout this is, and make things work one way or another. It may be that you hang a nymph, or if the dry fly, if they're not rising, whatever, you can make it work. And I found myself, actually, I think it was last year, possibly the year before, that I gave myself a good talking to. That I said, "Come on, Pete, you're overthinking it." When I came to my salmon, and I've taken the view that I kind of might more enjoy it for what it is. And yes, I'm thinking about the swing, I'm thinking about the speed, I'm thinking about changing those things, but I'm not now trying to overthink everything. So I just enjoy it. And if something grabs my fly, hopefully I've made the cast in the right place. I've done the basic stuff right and tried to mix things up the way the speed of the fly and everything else. If I've done that, I think I've done my part of the deal. And if a salmon decides to grab it, wonderful. But it doesn't matter so much. I just enjoy every minute for what it is now. And it's interesting actually coming around again that you said about, the farms, the salmon farms. And like you say, we'll skate around it a little bit. I think our listeners know, and we've talked a lot about pollution and the salmon farms and everything else on previous podcasts as well. But I wanted to, you're an extremely experienced angler that has fished in many places. What is the biggest change? I'm suspecting I probably know the answer to this, but what is the biggest change that you've seen in fishing over the years that you've detected?
Well, if we're talking about in Britain, obviously there's a great deal of angling pressure. A lot of beats, and if we talk about sort of game fishing, just to start with, the water has been covered day in and day out by a maximum number of rods in a lot of places. Whereas if you compare it with earlier days, where perhaps it wasn't necessary to rent everything out all the time, so I think there's more pressure on waters on the whole. Having said that, I'm a little worried that angler numbers generally are down. I know there was a flip during COVID, and for all types of psychological and spiritual reasons which we'll be familiar with, people wanted desperately to get out and to try anything which would kind of reconnect them to the great outdoors. But I think, or the main difference for fly fishing is that it's become more democratic, and with the opening up in the sort of late 60s, early 70s of the small still waters for trout fishing, a lot of coarse anglers are the bedrock of our angling community, and who make fantastic fly fishers when they try it, because they think in three dimensions and they're highly technical. I mean, most fishing is technical, but I'm so impressed by certain coarse anglers and match anglers. I've never been any good at that sort of thing. And I watch in admiration and awe. When they took up fly fishing for trout because it was more accessible, and you get a day ticket somewhere and so on and so forth, I think that the whole of angling began to merge again and mingle again in a way which it was in the kind of pre-Victorian period. And I like the idea that one isn't a specialist exclusive angler for one sort of, I'm not a specimen hunter. I've done very little carp fishing. I know that extremely experienced carp anglers and so on. But what I like is the idea that you go fishing for whatever there is around, and that you try different techniques. And I've always been a little upset by the coarse game distinction, which sort of came in high Victorian times. I understand is based on table qualities of fish and so on. But one is sometimes led to believe that there's coarse or game techniques, which you're talking about. But one of the differences, I think, now that there's been cross-fertilization, I think is what I'm trying to say, between the coarse and the game and the fly fishing and so on and so forth, and an enormous influx of ideas from abroad, because so the internet, which I'm quite suspicious in lots of ways, has been a real boon to the angling community, the international angling community, for exchanges of ideas, and you get transference of techniques from people who've tried things in one place for one species and brought them back here and exported them. Certainly in terms of salmon fly techniques, just to take one particular example, on the Helmsdale, there was a lot of dibbling with droppers was going on in sort of 60s and so on. And then some of those well-heeled tenants would go to Iceland and introduced some of the skating and dibbling techniques there, which have then been refined and exported elsewhere and to the Russian rivers and so on. And I find all that fascinating. So I think the sense of being part of quite a wide rather than a compartmentalized community is one of the changes. But I worry a little that we may be experiencing a generation that's about to miss out, of the younger generation. That's an awful old man's phrase to use, the younger generation. But the sort of before people go out into the wide world and actually don't have as much leisure time to take up angling, the teenage generation, I don't feel they're being mentored in any branches of the sport as much as I would like to see. And I was incredibly lucky that I had an elderly avuncular, well, he was an uncle, an avuncular mentor figure who took me under his wing and showed me the right way to try things, the right way to think about things. And there's some excellent organizations like Charlie Jardine's Fishing for Schools, which I'm a big supporter of, and others who are trying to make sure that we don't get a lost generation who never get the chance to try fishing. And I firmly believe that fishing, obviously not everybody likes it. I'm married to, as I say, to a civilian who doesn't understand fishing at all. But I think, like so many things, you need to be given a chance to try it, and it does get you away from your laptop. And so I'm a little worried that we may find fishing in the UK is got a declining number of followers, and there used to be statistic a few years ago there were 3 million anglers in the UK. It's quite difficult to calibrate the actual numbers because obviously licensed sales don't apply north of the border and so on. But I think the numbers are going down, and one of the things as an older and very lucky sportsman that I like to do is to try and make sure people get a chance to see for themselves what it's all about. And to a certain extent, that's one of the reasons that I try and write about the joys of it rather than the techniques about which I know precious little. I mean, as I get older. Fred Buller, who I used to know, who was a great pin-up of mine, was adamant that every day you go fishing, you learn something. And I think that's the right mindset. I don't know if you would agree as a guide, but even when guides learn from me when to duck when I'm casting, but at least they've learned something, because everybody fishes in a slightly different way. And, they bring something different to the water, and you take something different away. And I'm sure there are lots of other pastimes and passions and obsessions where you could say the same thing about mountain climbing or something. It's just fishing is the only one that I really know that sort of entered my soul in that way. So just to recap, I think that the international passion for fishing, which is almost every continent in the world, I like to feel I'm plugged into something which makes it very exciting. But I worry a little bit in the UK that some of these just attitudes to the countryside are slipping away from us, and it's a very difficult thing to bring back once people's mindsets and mentalities are totally urbanized. But I like to be an optimist where possible. I'm a pessimist in real life, but I'm an optimist when I've got my fishing hat on. I mean, another obvious change during the 60 years, I suppose it is, since I started fishing, is that we haven't got as many salmon as we used to, for which there are a number of conflicting theories and explanations. But I'm quite pessimistic about whether the cycles will ever really manage to regenerate themselves, despite the fact that anglers are not now the ones responsible for killing the fish.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that, and I'm worried about that. And I know we touched on it in a previous podcast about global warming and the effects that will have. You do, and I think I brought it up previously that, do we step away like they would do in the States and stop fishing for a bit to see? But the biggest worry is the climate as well. And obviously the farms and everything else when it comes to salmon. We talked about and touched on the pollution aspect, which I have many times, and had Fergal on here talking about it, and others as well. That is a worry to me. Are there more people fishing? I'm with you on that I think we saw that uptick because people bought a license because they wanted to do something to get back outside. And I think the mentor point of view is a really interesting one as well, because I think one of the reasons, maybe I could be wrong, But now children are exposed to so many things. So when I was younger, when you were younger, and others were younger, it was you played some cricket, you played football, you went fishing. Now there are so many things that children are encouraged to explore by parents, and fishing sort of, to me, it feels in some cases is pushed back. So it may be musical instrument, it may be ballet, it may be language, it may be the pressures of school as well that seem to be pushed onto children a little bit more, are not allowing them to do that. And of course, technology, everyone talks about, but we sit and watch, Emma and I, and we've been married 30 years. We still find something to talk about when we go out for lunch or dinner or we're away. Yet we watch people not even communicating and both looking at their phones. And I also worry that the art of communication is being lost. And as somebody like yourself, the ability of writing as well is being lost a little bit. So I think there's a number of things. But yeah, I wonder if children are being pulled in too many directions. And I understand why well-meaning parents, that they want their children to experience many things. But I think when I was younger, it seemed a bit more simpler. You did what you were doing, and there weren't many things to look at. But I don't know if that sort of kind of ties with what you're saying, I think, in a small way, doesn't it?
Yes. I mean, I think your point is actually so the thing about looking into phones, obviously, is an old man's complaint, and there are quite a few devalued forms of communication now, like, I'm afraid, understanding, very retro, but text messages and emails to a certain extent, and people don't send postcards, and they don't know how to write letters, and then you don't read in the same way. But that's the tide of human progress, and there's nothing very much that one can do about that. It's just that Britain has got such a variety of wonderful landscape. I mean, it always strikes me when you go abroad, usually quite big distances before there are noticeable changes in, I don't know, it's called geology or townscape or village architecture or something. But you only got to go for about half an hour anywhere in Britain, and you're in a slightly variegated version of where you started, and Britain is right under our noses, and I think sometimes we miss out the opportunity because everyone in the industry is encouraging us to go abroad and see the sights and so on, and that's very exciting and a great blessing if you've got the time and the money to do it. And one of the reasons we moved to Scotland is because it's just breathtaking scenery. I mean, I can't see another person's house from where I am, and that's a wonderful thing. I love being in cities when there's things to do, and I come south every month. But teaching and encouraging younger people, children, we've got grandchildren and so on here at the moment, that you can look out and look up, and you've got so much variety and splendor in a lot of places in the UK. And one wonderful way, and you'll know this as well as I do, of seeing the great outdoors is rod in hand. Because in some way, I know it's a bit fanciful and poetic, but you are slightly differently attuned to your surroundings when you go fishing. I mean, I suppose it's the same if you're a bird watcher, but I've never quite had the sort of patience for bird watching. But it's a similar kind of, that you're plugging into, and you're sort of trying to tune yourself into your surrounding. And I think that's good. That's good for one. It's good for one's brain, whatever it is that you do with your brain when you're not fishing. So the more people we can get out there, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll echo what you said about Charles and the work that he's doing to plant that seed. And it may be that it doesn't always stick with youngsters, but they may come back. And planting that seed's the important thing, and it may take a little bit more time to grow, but I think that it does. And it brings me round, before we move on to the book, about mentors. And you talked about your uncle, and I guess he's mentioned in the book that you mean Uncle Harold. And yes, he was a large part of your formative angling careers. I know your father fished too. Can you tell us a little bit about him and why he had such a big impact in your
about my
fishing
uncle?
career?
Yes, he was an uncle by marriage. And so I never knew either of my my grandfathers. They both died in the Second World War. And so he was a sort of grandpaternal influence in my earlier life. I'm talking when I was sort of 5, 6, 7. He was an older generation than my father. He'd been an aviator in the First World War in the Royal Flying Corps, and was an ace. He'd then gone on to be Under Secretary of State for Air, and he was a politician. Harold Balfour, his name was, and he was an actual hero. He'd been in a dogfight with the Red Baron. He'd been shot down over Vimy Ridge when he was 18. He got the MC and bar before he was 20. I mean, those were days that now, you can hardly believe that a man who'd been through all of that would take trouble with me as a little boy. He used to make me little paper aeroplanes and weight the nose cone with a paperclip, little gliders, and his hands were always pilot's hands, whatever he was doing. And he was mad keen on fishing and shooting. He'd long retired. He'd made quite a lot of money in the city, one way or another. And in his phrase, didn't want to deny himself anything. And so he would take fishing and shooting and with his friends. And he could see, I think, from quite an early age that I was watching when he was in his tackle room, sort of getting his gear together to go somewhere. And he took me along fishing in my later years, but he's the one who I think said to my father, I think David is quite interested, so you should try and take him fishing. And then when I had grown up a little bit, I used to go fishing with him as his fishing buddy, which was a wonderful thing because he fished all over the world. And he left me some of his extraordinary tackle. And I collect tackle, but not as a sort of a very knowledgeable collector, but I amass tackle, I should probably call it. And I've got some of his reels, which have literally caught thousands of fish, some of them. And I bet you're the same. You pick up something like that, and it's a bit like a sort of, I was almost going to say like a sacred object, but you'd want to interrogate the reel and his hip flask. I wrote about it in the book, the enormous hip flask. And you'd like to say to them, you'd like to interview them and say, what have you seen? And here you are in my hands, and now you're mine, and I'll pass it on to somebody else. So he was a big influence because he set an example to me. He was an old-fashioned Edwardian sportsman. He was a stickler for discipline. You had to learn how to cast before you would take you to the river and so on. But I caught my first salmon with him when I was 13. It was a long time ago now. And I've got my father took a picture of him gaffing the salmon. Is actually in the air, a sort of extraordinary shot to have. Of course, nobody has freshwater gaffs now, not legally. He took me abroad for the first time fishing abroad when I was still an undergraduate. And he took me to the eastern seaboard of Canada, which was sort of an eye-widening experience. Because he had a friend who'd been in the Canadian Royal Flying Corps called Casey Irving. And Casey Irving had been working at a gas station when he was a young man. And he couldn't quite see why the gas companies were making so much money. And he wasn't making very much money. So he went into the petrol industry himself and became the founder of Irving Oil, which is one of the biggest Canadian companies. And Casey Irving invited my uncle to go fishing in his private camp on the Restigouche River, which is one of the fabled, even I read about it as a boy. And Irving himself didn't fish, but he ran 2 camps on the Restigouche for his friends and family. And when I was 18, my uncle flew me out. He'd been director of British Airways, so he got free tickets. Those were the days. I mean, people are going to hate me for this story. And we flew in to Halifax. We were met by the pilot at the motel the next morning in a small aeroplane, flew out to Casey's camp. And I had a week's fishing on the Restigouche, and I caught the second morning I caught fish of 19 and 22 pounds on a single-handed rod, and one of them was on a dry fly. I mean, I'm totally spoiled brat, but my uncle could see the great delight which it was, and we enjoyed each other's company. So what was nice about it, and this is a really important aspect of fishing, I think, is, it is an intergenerational experience, can be, the father and son thing, and indeed, I'm sure, mother and daughter. And he could see that I really got the bug bad. And I went on fishing with him, fished on the River Tweed with him, which he used to take every year for a week. And then as he became older and more infirm, I used to row him around and drive him around and look after him. And we never stopped chatting about all types of things together. So he was enormously influential, not just on what I suppose I've got to call now my fishing career or journey, but also as a human being. I looked up to him in so many ways. He was a thoroughly decent, highly intelligent man, and we had this shared passion which spanned the centuries almost. I mean, he was, Queen Victoria was on the throne when he was born. And you did, and I'm always interested in this, whether it's within the fishing context or not. You don't have to go very many conversations if you're a very old person, a very young person, to go back in sort of Napoleonic times. Like modern history is very compressed in some ways, and I'm quite interested in angling history and the way in which things get transmitted. That sort of oral transmission of stories, much of which is flim-flam, but some of which is not, and that's another reason why fishing in people's company, it can be so agreeable and so fascinating, because there is so much more to it than just what you're catching. There are people's stories, tales from the riverbank, if you like. But once they go back that far, they become almost like tribal stories. And I think fishing is not unique in that respect, but I think it does it in a way which certainly other field sports can't quite do. It's partly because of its sort of sheer antiquity, but also there's something about telling stories and tale telling, and I don't mean whoppers, that fishing has an affinity for, which is why the literature, the printed literature, is so extensive and I think genuinely quite rich in quality.
Yeah, that was beautiful, a beautiful story, and again circles round to what we were saying, the importance of a mentor, and it is quite clear how deep an impact your uncle and your father had on you as your fishing career, and that may be one of the reasons that there are so many different things to look at now. But you touched on the restitution. Before we move on to the book, this is mentioned in the book, and it made me laugh immensely about the guide there, Wilfred Roy, and where you were staying, bears were in the vicinity. And I believe he had some quite important advice for you as well about what to do if you saw a bear.
Well, I said to him, sort of naive, as a greenhorn, he said, you got to, I probably can't do the accent, but it's a very particular New Brunswick accent. You got to watch out for the bears. And I said, what happens if I see a bear walking around camp? He said, you throw shit in his face. And I said, well, where am I going to find that? You put your hand down, you'll find it.
I laughed that. That did make me laugh out loud.
I hadn't fished with any Scottish gillies who would have said something like that. He was a real rough old backwoodsman, but he was the first overseas guide I fished with, and he wasn't happy that he got a la-di-da teenage English guy, who he got to look after in his canoe because of canoe fishing, very intimate kind of fishing. But he really taught me so much, and he realized that I wanted to learn, and I was going to listen, and I was going to try and do what he said. He was a really grumpy guy, but I had that symbiotic relationship with him by the end of the week, and I went back a few years later, and everything was sort of, well, not sweetness and light, but you do just learn so much if you listen. There is, and there is a lot to learn. There's still a lot to learn. That's one of the joys of it.
Yeah, I think that's why we love it so much, isn't it? We're always, as you said, always learning. But I'd love to move on to your book, The Lightning Thread. Could you tell listeners a little bit of what the book is actually about, please?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. And I hear your doggy. Mine's just gone up. I'm going to plug the book. That's the paperback. It's coming out very shortly. it's sometimes said that there are two types of fishing literature. There's the memoir and the manual. And the memoir is romantic fiction, and the manual is science fiction. I wanted to write a memoir that wasn't quite run of the mill. So what I've done is I've interspersed the chapters of sort of chronological, how I started fishing and up to my sort of later adventures and war stories, with essays, which sort of digressions on different aspects of angling that have always interested me. So there's one chapter on tiddlers, small fry. There's one about superstition. There's one about drinking. There's one about writing, and so on. And every book's got to have some kind of elevator pitch, and I suppose mine would be that you hear this. One of the many sort of angling proverbs: "Oh, there's more to fishing than the mere business of catching fish." And I thought, I said, well, so like what? I mean, why don't we look at what some of those things are? I think we all know that as anglers that it's mainly about fishing, but it's also about other things, and it may be spiritual things. I don't. We've touched on the fact that a lot of it is about company with people and the places that you are, and the sheer fascination and beauty of the quarry, and so on. And so I wanted to try and explore why it is that I have been so obsessively fascinated by and intrigued by all these aspects of fishing, the natural history and the technical history and the literature and so on. And I called it The Lightning Threads. It's a quotation from a very long poem by Dylan Thomas. So I don't know if he was ever a fisherman himself, but he uses fishing as a metaphor called The Ballad of the Long-Legged Bait. And it's about big game trolling. I mean, it's really not a fishing poem. It just uses it as a figure of speech. And he describes the moment of connectivity when I think it's a trolling reel, I imagine it is, where there's thunder under his thumbs, he says of the angler, as the line goes out, and he calls it the lightning thread. And one of the things which so many anglers seem to agree when they discuss it is that moment where you are connected to the life of a fish. Whether it's a big one, whether you can't see it, you don't know, it doesn't matter. There is that moment of connection. And so the thread that connects you with the fish and its world and its history and its past and its future is the thing which I've used as the thread to connect my fishing stories together. And it's got a subtitle which is Physiological Moments and the Pursuit of Paradise. Well, Pursuit of Paradise, I think, is something we all think there's somewhere there's going to be an ideal secret carp pond in an old monastery or something, or there's going to be a mountaintop tarn with a great brown trout, whatever it might be. And there's a certain restlessness, which I think is got to do with a sort of hunter-gatherer spirit, maybe a little, but there's an unfinished business for fishermen. And Physiological Moments is not something that I came up with, and I wish I had. It's actually a quotation from an Irish gillie from a book called Fishing and Thinking by A.A. Luce, who was at Dublin professor of moral philosophy in the 1950s. And he wrote this lovely book. I expect you know it, and I thoroughly recommend it to anyone who hasn't had a chance. It's been reissued in paperback, called Fishing and Thinking. And his Irish gillie used this phrase for that moment critique when, as we were saying earlier, everything comes together just right for you, And we all know that. We aspire to it. We dream of it. We're discussing it now. And I wanted the nicest thing that anybody said to me about my book was that you could enjoy it if you weren't a fishing person, as a reader. And I was hoping that some of it might communicate, just what is it all about? What is this essence? And of course, I haven't managed to define it any more than any other writer, but it's something which, if only you could discover what the secret was and bottle it, you'd be a very rich person. So it's about the bits of fishing which appeal to you, which are not just catching fish. That's really what the book tries to do. That's what it tries to do.
It does it incredibly well, and it's beautifully researched, beautifully written, and covers so many topics. And as I showed you when we were talking off mic, I've got so many questions for you, but I think you've encapsulated that beautifully. But you talked about the connection. And one of the things I'd been thinking about that you'd written, that you said that, our pastime is different to other field sports in that we're connected to our quarry by a line, whereas the pulling of a trigger is a final act, as it were. But do you think the connection with the fish gives us time to consider the outcome of the fight? So once that it's landed, we can make that decision, and more so now that we are in a catch and release environment, it's more likely a fish is going to go back. But do you think that is one of the differences in the field sports between fishing and using a gun for bird, deer, whatever it may be? Do you think that is one of the differences?
Yeah, I think it's one of the differences. I'm not trying to make a moral statement about killing. I think, every hunter, and I'm using an angler, recreational angler, in putting in that context too, has to make his or her mind up before they make an attempt on the life of a creature, how they feel about it, how they square their conscience. I'm not talking about killing for sustenance and food. I think the option of sparing or releasing your quarry is a different part of the mindset. I have nothing against certain forms of shooting and stalking. I don't happen to hunt, but that's a different, perhaps a slightly different case. I think it's not just about the killing; it's about the actual feeling you're connected to the quarry, whether you're going to kill it or not. It creates a kind of a circuit which you don't get when a bird is coming. I mean, the nearest equivalent I have is you flighting wildfowl or something, But actually feeling it, through the line, and in some way identifying with it in a different sort of a way, I think it does put fishing into a slightly different category. And also the sort of, I've always been interested in the act of the imagination of the fisherman. Now, I've said in the book, it's rather fancy to say, well, you're thinking about things in a very special way while you're waiting to see if you're going to catch a fish. Some people say that's rubbish. I think about fishing. That's absolutely fine. I'm not trying to sort of lay down the law about it, but there are intervals. What Tom McGuane, is one of my great pin-ups, who wrote The Longest Silence, called it The Longest Silence, which is the intervals between action, between activity. What does the human mind, what does the angler's mind experience during that time? Some of the time, you're imagining the fish. Is the fish there? Ted Hughes wrote brilliantly about it, that your mind goes out and sort of concentrates on your float, for instance, and you imagine the fish deep down in the dark, which may not even be there. And it's almost like, I think I might have mentioned the book, I can't remember if I did, but it's almost like a seance, not, is there anybody there? There's a big question mark over fishing. Even if actually you can see the fish, you still don't know quite how you're going to make that connection. And so I think it's quite it's full of mental activity and energy. For me, it doesn't work like that for everybody. And I'm not saying one attitude is better than the other. Far from it. Is whatever does it, But generally speaking, I find that Walton called it the contemplative art. There's quite a lot of thinking goes on when you're away from the water. But actually, when you get to the water, it's very hard to think about anything else other than the water and the fish and what you're trying to do. Whatever technique, whatever form of fishing you're doing, and I think that is actually what sets it apart from a lot of other rural activities.
Yeah, very, very eloquently put. And you cover so many aspects of fishing within the book as well, from saltwater, Cuba you talk about, Russia you talk about, trout, bonefish. So there's everything sort of covered that I know listeners will find fascinating. And you mentioned Ted Hughes there as well. And a couple of times I think he crops up in the book at least, where you fish with him in Scotland. I was thrilled to read about you fishing the Torridge with him as well. That must have been, I know some of the stories that you mentioned in there, and it must have been pretty memorable fishing with him too, mustn't it?
Well, it was. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that he was a great sort of buddy of mine. We knew each other well enough that he wrote the introduction to one of my earlier fishing books, which was very nice of him. I fished with him kind of like half a dozen times in different places. Obviously, as you will know better than most people, the West Country was deep in his heart, although he was a Yorkshireman. And he made that his home, his spiritual home. There is a book coming out actually on the same day as my paperback, called The Catch, Fishing for Ted Hughes by Mark Wormald, who's a friend of mine. And it's a study of Hughes's fishing diaries, hitherto unpublished, and his poetry, particularly the volume River, and explores his writing through his relationship with fish and fishing and fishermen. It's a fabulous book. I don't mind plugging somebody else's book because it's really first rate, and I recommend it. And Mark got in touch with me because he knew that I had fished a bit with Ted. I first met Ted with Dermot Wilson, who was another kind of a mentor, and was very, very taken with him. I mean, he had this extraordinary intensity, which almost everybody had remarked on. He was crazy about fishing. I mean, made some of us look like rank amateurs. And fishing is and the world of water, underwater, is just runs through so much of his writing, as I'm sure you know. I fished with him in the Hebrides. I fished with him with Dermot on the Avon, and I fished in the West Country with him. And he was very he was a very accomplished fisherman. He was a hungry fisherman. I mean, he wanted to catch as much of, there were no kind of mincing around the bank, chatting about the chaffinches and things. I mean, when he was there, he gave it his undivided attention. You wouldn't want to be a fish anyway near Ted. And I've got, so I gave out after dinner a talk at his old college, where Mark Wormald is one of the English tutors at Cambridge. And I was explaining how I'd seen some of Ted Hughes's tackle. And he was very superstitious, as I am, and I don't know if you are, but a lot of anglers are. And he would never cut a knot. He would cut the knot off and leave the knot on the swivel or on the fly, so they kind of bristled. And as an illustration of the sort of interface between magic and superstition of fishing, as I was trying to impress my academic audience. And afterwards, a friend of his came up and gave me an envelope, and in that envelope was one of Ted Hughes's Blair spoons with 4 blood knots on the top. And he gave it to me, and I put it in my pocket. I've got it on. I have in my room here. I bought at auction Ted's lectern, which he used to stand at and write down in Taunton. I bought it at the auction. It was made for him by his son Nick, who was a fisheries scientist in Alaska, who was his great fishing companion. So, I mean, it was like fishing with W.B. Yeats or Homer or something, and here was this colossus of the literary world. And again, going back to what we said, the connection between us was the fishing. He wasn't interested in my writing particularly, I was very interested in his writing, but we talked fish, and he talked about fishing, Shakespeare, and this, that, and the other. It was just, he was one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. It was a great privilege to have looked into the water with him.
That sounds lovely. And North Taunton's the next village along from me as well. So I kind of know some of those bits of the tour that I think he fished, certainly
Yes.
on the upper section and around that part of the world, which is wonderful, a wonderful connection. But I think we've given listeners a good idea of what the book is about. But tell me, what did you take from writing? Did you take anything from writing this book that is, I guess, part memoir as well, as you said, and the essays and everything else? Did you learn anything about it? And did you learn anything about yourself from writing it?
Well, I think I think you always learn something from the writing process. It'd be very hard for me to put my finger on exactly it. And sometimes experience can only be apprehended by trying to nail it down in words, I think. Or if I was a painter or a sculptor, I would say in whatever the medium is that I was trying to work it. It focuses you. So I think it was Arthur Ransom who said, you observe things if you're going to write them down in a slightly different way, and I think what I took from the experience of writing the book, which is a sort of distillation of many decades of fishing. I'm not an expert fisherman, but I'm a veteran, experienced fisherman, and I've been very lucky in that respect, is just what an extraordinarily rich experience angling can be. It appeals to so many different types of people, and it's amazing what crossover there is wherever you are once you have this in common, and that it does go deeper into the sort of, I would say, if I'm being pretentious, which I am, I would say that it has something to do with the human spirit or the human soul, and there is a magical allure to it which no man or woman has ever managed to account for, and I just gave it my best shot. I was also, to answer your question, I realized how incredibly lucky I've been, and still am, to be a fisherman and to have had so many opportunities. I got a lot of opportunities as a journalist in the 80s and the 90s. I was a fishing correspondent for the Daily Telegraph for almost 10 years, and then went on to the Express and Country Life and so on. I got kind of in the pre-internet travel period a lot of opportunities to go and write features in exotic places that I would never have had a chance to go to otherwise, because advertorial was the thing that travel companies all wanted in big deal publications like that. Now it's a little harder because people do things on the internet and do them themselves. So my world was opened up quite early on, and I now realize, looking back, that been a very full program of fishing around the world, which I couldn't have devised for myself. And had I had a proper career, as a businessman or a lawyer or a scientist or something, I would never have got all those hours on the water. And going back to what we were saying at the beginning, I mean, in the end, it boils down to the amount of time you can give. It escalates. It's more than the sum of its parts. And if you've only got that precious week because you work so hard, you only got one precious week to go every year. It's not the same thing, And so I've been utterly, utterly spoiled, and I don't regret a moment of it.
I think that's wonderful. I loved where you talked about the Red Francis salmon fly and that the takes were like a bodybuilder's handshake as well. I thought that was absolutely fantastic. A great description of how that fly works wonderfully. This is a silly question, though. Fishing for you, you can tell it oozes out of you that your passion for it burns just as bright, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. I mean, the day that you get blasé about fishing and then you got to go and buy a set of golf clubs, I think, or something. No, and it is always fresh. That's the word we used at the beginning, and that's the word I would use. I've never felt stale about it. I suppose some fishing is a bit artificial, if you would overly stock small areas, but generally speaking, there is something new going on all the time, and I still can't sleep well the night before I know I'm going fishing, and that's as eloquent a statement as I can make about it in my old age.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm exactly the same. I think I'm old enough to know better, but it just keeps going. And the book, again, we look at Canada, there's the River Lee in Hertfordshire, which I know a little bit about, the Tweed, the Falklands for sea trout. There's so many places, Cuba, that you discover. Is there one place that still eludes you, or is there a place, I tell you what, is there a place you visited that has been deeply memorable for you, and is there a place that you haven't visited that you would just love to visit?
Well, I'll take those questions in opposite order, Pete. I don't know South America at all well, and I would love to go. If you give me a second proverbial week, before the Grim Reaper arrives. I think I'd like to go freshwater Dorado fishing somewhere like the Paraná, or Brazil somewhere. I've got one or two friends, I'm sure you have too, been lucky enough to do it, and they say that's wonderful. I have been tiger fishing in Africa, and I think it would be an equivalent experience. And there are some places, I believe, where you can sight fish for them with a fly. Yes, I think that's what I'd like to do. Anywhere in South America, I think I would go. In terms of places I've been, I'd love to go back to New Zealand, but I've only been once, and is just fantastic as a destination altogether. And my wife and I went for a month. We went to visited 4 fishing lodges, but there was also non-fishing travel writing going on. I'd love to go back there. That's unfinished business, but you mentioned Cuba. I've got a chapter on Cuba in the book because it's the place I've been to abroad most. I've been there, I think, 13 times, fishing every time. And I'm hoping to get back this year also. But again, on a travel commission. That's got everything for me. I love saltwater fly fishing. I love any form of sight fishing. It sort of ups the ante for me. If you can see the quarry, you've got to be fairly competent to catch some of those saltwater species, as you know. I love the confusion of the heat and the overexcitement of the salt and the rum and all those sort of things. It's got everything. It's exotic and a relatively untapped fishing resource when I first went there. And it's still got lovely wild set offshore areas where you won't see very many other anglers and boats. But Bhutan next year is a possibility. Wonderful. And Alaska, I went with my 2 boys to Alaska when I've been to a couple of times. I went with Arthur Oglesby in the old days. I would love to go back there and fish for silvers. There's always something. There's a bucket list, a huge bucket list of things, and if I'm spared, I'm planning to tick those things off as well.
They sound very civilized. I think Bhutan's near the top of my list too, I have to say. I saw the program Charles Rangeley Wilson did out there, and there was an Australian program, a river somewhere as well, that covered it beautifully. Mm-hmm. And it just looked an amazing place. The whole environment and everything that went with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's fascinating what you're saying about, I'm so with you. And it was only yesterday I was having this conversation about seeing fish. I know we were talking off mic at the beginning about fishing chalk streams and seeing them. And just yesterday I was fishing the Tamar and I was lower down the system there. And my wife and I were fishing for salmon. There wasn't really anything going on. We'd given it a good go. There wasn't a great deal going on. And I saw some mullets. And that was it. And I was and I said to Emma, it's so exciting, particularly in the West Country, to be able to see the fish. And I said to her, if you weren't here, I'd have stood here until I caught one, because just seeing them feeding, not eating my flies, but that there's something special about seeing those fish and then, as you say, that connection. Yet there is also that other angle that when that line goes tight, when you haven't seen the fish, you don't know what's there as well. And it's a double-edged sword, which is a wonderful one that still excites me so much. And I think you've captured this so beautifully in this book. And I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It's made me laugh. It's made me cry, all sorts of stuff. That it's just such a beautifully written piece of work that, as listeners know, I don't get paid to say these things. I say them because I want to share them with people, and I think they'll get something out of reading these sorts of books. So I'd like to thank you for being a guest on here, David. I'd like to thank you for writing that book and being in fishing, and your enthusiasm for fishing has rubbed off on me. If it needed to, it's never needed to, but I've thoroughly enjoyed that. The Lightning Thread, where can people find that and where can they buy a copy of it?
Well, it should be quite widely stocked in bookshops. All the Waterstones. Look, I'm a great supporter of local bookshops, and you can get it, pre-order it from the Scribner. It's published by Scribner UK, which is part of Simon & Schuster. The hardback's around as well, but the paperback comes out on the 28th of April. And if you look it up on the website, you could probably order one. Amazon obviously will have it. And I thoroughly thank you for saying such nice things about it. It's been such a pleasure to meet you like this. And what we need to do next is to fish together.
That sounds absolutely wonderful. David, thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today. I could have spoken to you for hours and hours and hours. I have so many questions that we didn't cover, but you answered and spoke with such eloquence that I've just thoroughly enjoyed listening to your stories. And as I said, I could have listened a whole long time longer too. But thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Thank you, Pete.
Everyone, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. And once you have a copy of the book, I hope you enjoy reading it as much as I have. But as ever, there will be many more episodes of the Fly Culture podcast for you to listen to. So thank you so much again for listening to this one.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.